stories that have led to this widespread fear. One of the most compelling aspects of haunted dolls is the sheer number of people who claim to have experienced paranormal activity surrounding these objects, from strange noises and movements to unexplained events and even physical attacks. The stories surrounding haunted dolls are as varied as they are chilling. But what's perhaps most fascinating is the way that these stories often seem to defy explanation, leaving us with more questions than answers. Take, for example, the story of a woman who claimed to have been haunted by a porcelain doll she found in her attic. According to her, the doll would move on its own, and she would hear strange whispers coming from it at night. When she finally worked up the courage to investigate, she discovered that the doll had been made by a mentally ill woman who had imbued it with her own dark energy. Annabelle, the notorious Raggedy Ann doll, is another famous example of a haunted doll that's said to have been inhabited by a malevolent spirit. According to legend, Annabelle was possessed by the spirit of a young girl who died in the house where the doll was found, and it's said to have been responsible for all manner of terrifying events, from levitating objects to physical attacks. Annabelle's reputation is as fearsome as it is fascinating. And then there's Robert the doll, a creepy antique figurine that's said to be haunted by the spirit of its former owner, a wealthy and eccentric artist. According to those who've crossed paths with Robert, he's responsible for all manner of mischief, from strange noises and movements to even physical attacks. What's perhaps most unsettling about Robert, however, is his uncanny ability to seemingly change expression, as if he's watching and waiting for his next victim. One of the most shocking stories surrounding Robert is that of a family who claimed to have been haunted by him after they brought him into their home. According to them, Robert would move on his own, and they would hear strange noises and whispers coming from him at night. But what's most chilling is that they would often find him in different positions, as if he was watching them, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. As we delve deeper into the world of haunted dolls, it becomes increasingly clear that these stories are more than just mere urban legends. They're a reflection of our deep-seated fears, and a reminder that even the most mundane objects can hold a dark and sinister energy. Whether you believe in the supernatural or not, there's no denying the spine-tingling chills that these stories send down our spines. So, the next time you see a doll sitting on a shelf or in a toy box, remember the terrifying stories that surround these seemingly innocent objects. And who knows, maybe you'll start to wonder if your own dolls are watching you, waiting for the perfect moment to come to life. Thanks for joining me on this journey into the creepy world of haunted dolls. If you've got a creepy doll story of your own, be sure to share it in the comments below. And if you're looking for more chilling horror stories, be sure to check out another one of my videos for a healthy dose of fear and fascination.
Part 1: The Doll in the Attic. It all started with an old porcelain doll I found in my grandmother's attic. I hadn't been to the house since she passed, and it was only now, 6 months later, that I finally mustered the courage to go through her things. The attic was dimly lit by a single window, its glass clouded by decades of dust, and the scent of old wood and mothballs clung to the air. There it sat, among the piles of forgotten belongings, its white face peeking out from a tattered box, staring at me with its glassy, vacant eyes. The doll's pale skin was cracked in places, its once vibrant dress faded, and its hair tangled and dirty. I remember feeling a chill when I first saw it, a sense of wrongness that I couldn't shake. But curiosity got the better of me, and I picked it up, examining the strange markings etched into its back. My grandmother never mentioned owning any dolls. In fact, I couldn't recall ever seeing it during all the years I spent in that house. It was as if the doll had appeared from nowhere. I should have left it in the attic, but something about it drew me in, maybe the sheer mystery of its existence. I took it home, telling myself it was a piece of family history. I placed it on the mantel in my living room, thinking it would make an interesting conversation piece. But that first night, things started to go wrong. I was woken up by a strange, rhythmic tapping noise. Half asleep, I assumed it was the wind knocking a tree branch against the house. But when I got up to check, I found no tree nearby. The noise continued, soft yet deliberate. It wasn't coming from outside, it was coming from the living room. I walked down the hallway, my footsteps tentative, the air in my home unnaturally cold. When I entered the living room, the noise stopped. The only sound was the faint creak of the wooden floors beneath my feet. I glanced around, my eyes falling on the doll. It was sitting there, as I had left it, but something was different. The way its head tilted slightly to the side, its eyes now seemed to be following me, watching. I brushed it off as paranoia. Maybe I hadn't placed it so precisely after all. But when I reached out to adjust the doll, my hand froze just inches from its face. The air around it was icy cold, like the breath of something lurking just beneath the surface. I recoiled, telling myself I was being ridiculous. It was just a doll. But I didn't sleep much that night. The next morning, I found the doll lying face down on the floor. It must have fallen off the mantel, I reasoned. But there was something unsettling about the way its body had twisted on the ground, limbs splayed at unnatural angles. I set it back in place, though the unease that had settled in my chest the night before hadn't left me. That's when the whispers started. It was faint at first, just a soft murmur at the edge of my hearing. I thought it was the wind, or maybe my mind playing tricks on me after the restless night. But as the days passed, the whispers grew louder, more insistent. They came from the living room, always when I was alone, and they always seemed to be coming from the direction of the doll. One night, I finally worked up the nerve to investigate. I crept into the living room, the house deathly silent, except for those infernal whispers. I could almost make out words now, though the voice was raspy, hoarse, like something that hadn't spoken in years. My heart pounded as I approached the mantel, my eyes locked on the doll's unblinking gaze. The moment I touched it, the whispers stopped. I nearly dropped the doll as I stumbled backward. Its face, no, something about its eyes had changed. They were darker, hollowed out, as if some void was swirling behind those glass pupils, watching me with a malevolence I hadn't sensed before. I shoved it into a drawer, out of sight, but that only seemed to make things worse. The next night, I woke to the sound of shuffling, soft, deliberate footsteps. They were coming from the hallway. My breath caught in my throat as I realized those steps were coming toward my room. I didn't dare move. My heart hammered in my chest as I listened to the sound grow closer, stopping just outside my door. I squeezed my eyes shut, praying it was just a nightmare, that I'd wake up any second. But I didn't. Instead, the door slowly creaked open, the hinges groaning as it swung inward. I was frozen, too terrified to breathe. And then I heard it, a soft, almost playful giggle, coming from the hallway. I didn't sleep again that night. By morning, I knew I had to get rid of the doll. I wrapped it in an old blanket and stuffed it into a box, determined to take it as far away from my house as possible. But as I carried the box outside, something strange happened. The weight of it shifted, no, not shifted. It moved. The doll inside was moving. I nearly dropped the box in shock. But when I set it down and tore open the blanket, the doll was perfectly still, its lifeless gaze staring up at me once more. The air around me felt heavy, oppressive. I had the unsettling feeling that it was laughing at me, silently mocking my fear. I tried to throw it away. But every time I left the doll somewhere, whether it was in the trash, at the dump, or even abandoned miles away, it always found its way back. By the next morning, it would be sitting on my doorstep, waiting. That was when I realized, this wasn't just a doll. Something was inside it, something dark and malevolent. And no matter what I did, it wasn't going to let me go. Part 2, The Doll's Return. I started to unravel after that first week. No matter where I left the doll, whether it was in a dumpster, at the bottom of a river, or buried deep in the woods, it always came back. Each morning, I'd open my door to find it sitting there, like some grotesque reminder that I couldn't escape. Its porcelain face would be turned just slightly upward, its dead eyes staring into mine, as if it knew. It always knew. I stopped sleeping, terrified of what might happen while I was unconscious. Every night, I'd hear the soft creaks and whispers coming from the living room, always growing louder, more insistent. The doll wanted something, but I didn't know what. I tried to ignore it, telling myself I was losing my mind, that this was all some elaborate hallucination brought on by grief and stress. After all, I'd just lost my grandmother, I wasn't sleeping, and I'd found this weird, old doll in her attic. Maybe that was all there was to it. But then came the dreams. The first one was subtle, almost mundane. I was in my house, standing in the kitchen, when I felt something watching me. I turned around and there it was, the doll, sitting at the table. It didn't move, but its eyes, they followed me. I remember waking up in a cold sweat, my heart racing, but I brushed it off. Just a dream, I told myself. The next night, the dream was worse. I was lying in my bed, the room dark and silent, when I felt a pressure on my chest. It was as if something heavy was sitting on me, pinning me down. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. And then I saw it, hovering above me, the doll's face inches from mine. Its glassy eyes were wide, and its mouth was twisted into a grotesque smile, something far too human for a porcelain figure. I screamed, but no sound came out. When I woke, I was gasping for air, my body drenched in sweat. But the worst part wasn't the dream, it was the fact that when I opened my eyes, the doll was sitting at the foot of my bed. I hadn't brought it there. That was when I knew this wasn't something I could ignore or rationalize away. This wasn't grief or stress. The doll was real, and whatever was inside it, whatever malevolent force had taken root in that porcelain shell, it was getting stronger. I decided to call a friend, someone who knew a little more about the paranormal. Emily had always been into that kind of stuff, ghosts, hauntings, witchcraft. If anyone could help me figure out what was going on, it was her. When I explained the situation over the phone, she didn't laugh or tell me I was crazy. Instead, she asked me a question that sent a shiver down my spine. "Did you ever ask your grandmother about the doll?" "No," I replied, my voice shaky. "I found it in the attic after she passed." "Why?" "Because," Emily said slowly, "that doll sounds like it's more than just a creepy old toy. Dolls can be used as vessels, you know." "Vessels?" "For spirits," she explained. "Sometimes, if someone's desperate enough, they'll bind a spirit to an object to keep it from moving on. It's a form of control. But if the spirit is angry, or if it wasn't bound properly." Her voice trailed off, but I knew what she was implying. "Is there any way to get rid of it?" I asked, the fear creeping into my voice. Emily hesitated. "There might be. I'll come over, but don't touch the doll. Don't move it again. Whatever you do, don't try to get rid of it on your own." The call ended, and I sat there in silence, my mind racing. If what Emily said was true, if the doll was a vessel for something, some spirit that was bound to it, then I had made a huge mistake by bringing it into my home. Worse, I'd tried to throw it away, bury it, even destroy it. No wonder it was angry. I could feel its presence now, even when I wasn't in the same room. It was like the doll was watching me through the walls, its energy dark and oppressive. I didn't dare go into the living room anymore. Every time I walked past the doorway, I could feel it, the icy cold air, the way the hairs on the back of my neck would stand on end. The whispers were constant now, just low enough that I couldn't make out the words, but I could feel their intent, like a malicious force pressing down on me. That evening, Emily arrived, carrying a small bag filled with what I could only assume were her witchy supplies, candles, herbs, and what looked like a piece of chalk. She was quiet as I led her to the living room, her eyes widening when she saw the doll sitting on the mantel. "That's it?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. I nodded, my throat too dry to speak. Emily approached the doll cautiously, her eyes narrowing as she examined it. She didn't touch it, but she stood close enough that I could see the tension in her shoulders, the way her body stiffened the longer she looked at it. "There's something very wrong with this," she said, her voice tight with fear. "Whatever's attached to this doll, it's not human." I swallowed hard, my heart pounding in my chest. "What do we do?" Emily took a deep breath and pulled out a small bundle of herbs from her bag. "I'm going to cleanse the space first, try to weaken whatever's attached to it. Then we'll try to communicate with it, figure out what it wants." "Communicate with it?" I stammered. "You mean like, talk to it?" She nodded. "We need to know why it's here, what it's trying to do. If we don't, it'll keep getting stronger." I didn't want to talk to it. I didn't even want to be in the same room as it. But I trusted Emily, and if she thought this was the only way to deal with the doll, then I had no choice. As Emily began to light the herbs and wave the smoke around the room, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. The air grew colder, heavier, as if something unseen was pressing down on us. The whispers grew louder, more frantic, and the doll seemed to shift on the mantel, its head tilting ever so slightly toward us. Emily set up a circle on the floor, drawing symbols with the chalk and placing candles at each corner. She motioned for me to sit inside the circle with her, her face pale and drawn. "We're going to ask it why it's here," she said softly, her eyes locked on the doll. "Stay calm. No matter what happens, don't leave the circle." I nodded, my heart racing as I sat down beside her. Emily closed her eyes and began to chant softly, her words flowing in a language I didn't understand. The room grew colder still, the air thick with a palpable tension. Then, without warning, the doll's eyes blinked. I gasped, instinctively moving closer to Emily. The room seemed to warp around us, the shadows growing longer, darker. The whispers rose to a crescendo, filling the space with a cacophony of voices, each more desperate and angry than the last. Suddenly, the candles blew out, plunging us into darkness. "Emily?" I whispered, my voice trembling. Before she could answer, the doll moved. It didn't just shift or fall over, it stood up. Part 3, The Awakening. The doll didn't simply stand, it rose, as if pulled upright by some unseen force, its tiny porcelain feet scraping against the wooden mantel with an eerie screech. I could barely breathe, my pulse thundering in my ears as Emily scrambled to relight the candles. But it was too late, whatever barrier the circle was supposed to create had been shattered the moment the doll moved. Emily gasped, her voice trembling with panic as she fumbled with the matches. "Stay in the circle. Don't break it." I wanted to scream, to run, but I couldn't move. My body felt paralyzed, locked in place by an overwhelming sense of dread as the doll's head turned toward us, its glassy eyes narrowing in a grotesque mockery of life. For a moment, it stood perfectly still, its lifeless body swaying ever so slightly. Then, slowly, it took its first step. That was when the whispering turned into something else, something far worse. The soft, unintelligible murmurs that had plagued me for days became louder, clearer, until they were no longer whispers but voices, hundreds of voices, all speaking at once, their tones low and filled with malice. They hissed and spat, their words dripping with hatred, and though I couldn't make out everything they said, one word stood out above the rest. "Leave." The doll took another step, its tiny foot making a dull thud against the wooden floor. Its movements were jerky, unnatural, like a marionette being manipulated by a clumsy puppeteer. Each step brought it closer to the circle, closer to us, and the air grew thick with a foul, rotting smell. Emily was chanting again, louder now, her voice desperate as she relit the candles one by one. But the flames flickered weakly, as if whatever power had been unleashed was too strong for her to control. The symbols she had drawn on the floor began to smudge, the chalk lines distorting as if something invisible was dragging its fingers through them. "We need to stop this," I shouted, my voice cracking with fear. "It's getting stronger." Emily didn't respond. Her eyes were wide with terror, her focus entirely on the doll as it crept closer and closer to the edge of the circle. I could see the strain on her face, the way her hands shook as she tried to maintain the protective barrier. But it wasn't enough. The doll, whatever was inside it, was breaking through. Then, with a sharp crack, one of the candles tipped over, rolling across the floor and smearing the last intact chalk line. The barrier was broken. The moment the circle shattered, the air in the room shifted. The oppressive cold that had filled the space lifted, replaced by something far worse, a suffocating heat, thick and stifling, as if the very air was being burned away. And with it came the voices, louder now, vicious and mocking, their words twisting into my mind like hot iron. Asterisk, you can't stop me, asterisk. Emily screamed, her hands flying to her ears as if to block out the sound. But it didn't help. The voices weren't coming from the room, they were inside our heads, crawling through our thoughts like worms burrowing into flesh. I could feel them scratching at my skull, prying into the darkest corners of my mind, feeding on my fear. The doll moved faster now, its tiny legs twitching with unnatural speed. It was only a foot away from us, its face contorted into a cruel smile, the cracks in its porcelain skin deepening, spreading like veins of black rot. And its eyes, those cold, dead eyes, were fixed on me. In that moment, I realized what it wanted. Me. I stumbled backward, my body finally responding to the overwhelming terror, but there was nowhere to go. I was trapped, cornered in the middle of my own living room by something I couldn't even begin to comprehend. The doll's tiny hand reached out toward me, its fingers stained with grime and decay, and I could feel the air around me grow colder, tighter, as if it was wrapping itself around my throat. Get back! Emily shrieked, lunging forward with a handful of salt. She threw it toward the doll, her hand trembling so violently that most of it scattered across the floor. But a few grains hit their mark, landing on the doll's porcelain face with a sharp hiss. For a brief moment, the doll stopped. Its head jerked back as if it had been struck, and the whispers faltered, replaced by a deep, guttural growl that seemed to reverberate through the walls. The doll's smile faded, replaced by a look of pure, unadulterated rage. Then it screamed. The sound was inhuman, high-pitched and shrill, like the wail of something ancient and furious. It echoed through the room, shaking the walls and rattling the windows, and I felt it vibrate through my bones, filling my entire body with a sense of dread so deep it left me trembling. The doll's body convulsed, its limbs twitching violently as the cracks in its skin widened, splitting open to reveal something dark and pulsating beneath the surface. Its once pale face was now a grotesque mask of blackened veins and jagged cracks, and its eyes, those horrible, lifeless eyes, burned with a malevolent light. Emily, do something! I shouted, my voice barely audible over the cacophony of screams and whispers. I'm trying, she cried, frantically throwing more salt at the doll. But it wasn't working. Whatever power had been keeping the spirit at bay was weakening, and the doll was growing stronger by the second. Desperation clawed at me. I had to stop it, had to do something before the doll reached me. My mind raced, searching for anything, anything, that could help. Then I remembered the attic, the markings on the doll's back. I hadn't understood them before, but now they seemed important, like a clue I had missed. The markings! I shouted. On its back, there were markings. Emily's eyes widened with realization. That's it. The binding spell, it's still on the doll. We need to destroy it. But how? I didn't know the first thing about magic or spells, and Emily looked just as lost as I felt. There was no time for careful planning, no time for rituals or chants. The doll was inches away from me now, its fingers brushing against my leg, and the voices were screaming in my head, demanding that I let it in. I acted on pure instinct. Grabbing the doll with both hands, I flipped it over, my fingers tracing the strange symbols etched into its porcelain back. They were faint, worn with age, but I could feel the power in them, the energy that was holding the spirit inside the doll. It was weak, fragile, but still there. "Emily!" I yelled. "How do we break it?" "Smash it," she screamed. "Break the connection." Without thinking, I hurled the doll to the ground with all the strength I had left. The porcelain shattered on impact, fragments of the doll scattering across the floor. For a brief, heart-stopping moment, everything went still. The voices stopped, the air cleared, and the oppressive weight that had been pressing down on us lifted. But then came the darkness. It poured out of the broken doll like smoke, a swirling mass of shadows that filled the room, engulfing everything in its path. The temperature dropped, and the whispers returned, louder and more vicious than ever. This wasn't over. Not yet. The spirit, whatever had been trapped inside that doll, was free. Part 4, The Darkness Unleashed. The room plunged into chaos as the darkness spread from the shattered remains of the doll. It wasn't just smoke, it was something alive, something angry. It twisted and writhed like a living thing, filling the space with a suffocating, malevolent presence. I could feel it slithering over my skin, cold and oily, leaving a trail of dread in its wake. The voices were louder now, deafening in their fury, a cacophony of hatred that made my head feel like it was about to split open. Emily scrambled backward, her eyes wide with terror. "We have to leave," she screamed. "Get out of the house." I wanted to run. I wanted to tear out of that house and never look back. But I couldn't move. My legs felt like lead, my muscles locked in place by a fear so deep it rooted me to the spot. The darkness was closing in, swallowing the light from the candles, the room growing colder with every second. I could barely see Emily anymore, her figure swallowed by the black mist that now swirled around us. Suddenly, the shadows seemed to coalesce, forming a shape in the middle of the room, a tall, looming figure with no distinct features, just a mass of pure, suffocating darkness. And then, it started to move toward me. I opened my mouth to scream, but no sound came out. My throat was dry, my lungs frozen as I watched the figure approach. The voices, the hundreds of angry, whispering voices, rose to a terrifying crescendo, each word cutting into my mind like a shard of glass. And then I heard it, clear and unmistakable, a voice louder than the rest, a voice that didn't belong to the shadows but to something inside me. "You let me out, asterisk." I stumbled backward, my back slamming against the wall. The room felt smaller now, the shadows pressing in on all sides, leaving me nowhere to go. I could feel the figure's presence looming over me, its darkness reaching out, wrapping around my arms, my legs, binding me in place. The whispers echoed in my skull, repeating those same chilling words. "You let me out, asterisk." I tried to speak, tried to beg for it to leave, but my voice was gone, swallowed by the black mass that seemed to be tightening its grip on me. I could feel the cold seeping into my bones, an unnatural, hollow cold that drained the warmth from my body, from my very soul. It wasn't just trying to hurt me, it was trying to take me. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw Emily move. She was crawling toward the circle she had drawn earlier, the chalk lines smeared but still faintly visible on the floor. Her hands were shaking as she reached for the bag she had brought, fumbling to pull out something, salt, or maybe another herb. But the shadows were quicker. They surged toward her, knocking her to the ground, wrapping around her limbs and dragging her away from the circle. "Emily!" I tried to scream, but it was no use. The shadows had their grip on both of us now, pulling us deeper into the house, away from the circle, away from any hope of safety. I could hear Emily gasping for breath, her voice ragged as she struggled against the suffocating darkness. "We have to stop it," she choked out, her voice barely audible over the relentless whispers. "We have to send it back." "How?" I rasped, barely able to get the words out. "The spell, there's a reversal, in the bag, but you have to do it." "I can't." I didn't know anything about spells. I didn't even believe in this stuff until a week ago, but now? Now, I had no choice. I had let this thing out, and it was going to kill us both if I didn't stop it. My hands shook as I reached for the bag, desperately searching for whatever Emily was talking about. The darkness fought back, tightening its grip, pulling me further into the black abyss. I could feel it clawing at my mind, whispering vile things into my ears, things I couldn't understand but knew were meant to drive me mad. But I had to focus. I had to find the spell, find whatever could send this thing back to whatever hell it came from. My fingers closed around something, a small, worn book. Emily's spellbook. With trembling hands, I opened it, flipping through the pages as fast as I could, searching for anything that looked like it could help. The words were in a language I didn't understand, the symbols strange and twisted, but I didn't have time to decipher them. I just had to trust that Emily knew what she was doing. Here. I gasped, finding a page with a crudely drawn diagram that looked like the circle Emily had made earlier. Is this it? Emily nodded weakly, her face pale and slick with sweat. Draw the symbols, finish the spell. The chalk was scattered on the floor, half buried under the debris of the broken doll and the heavy darkness that filled the room. I crawled toward it, my body feeling like it was moving through thick, freezing water. Every inch felt like a mile, but I managed to grab the chalk, my fingers numb and stiff as I started to draw. The darkness hissed and writhed, pulling at my arms, my legs, trying to stop me. I could hear the voices screaming now, furious and desperate. They knew what I was trying to do, and they weren't going to let me finish. But I kept going. I dragged the chalk across the floor, connecting the broken lines of the circle, redrawing the symbols as best as I could, even though I had no idea if I was doing it right. I could barely see through the thick, oily shadows that filled the room, but I kept going, my heart pounding in my chest, fear driving me forward. As I finished the last symbol, the air around us changed. The whispers grew louder, more frantic, as if the darkness itself was panicking. I could feel the shadows pulling away from me, recoiling as the power of the circle took hold. It's working! I shouted, my voice raw and hoarse. Emily's face lit up with a glimmer of hope, but it was short-lived. The darkness, though retreating, wasn't giving up without a fight. The black figure in the center of the room surged forward, its shape twisting and warping, becoming something larger, more monstrous. It no longer resembled the tiny doll that had housed it, it was something far more terrible, a shape that seemed to devour the very light around it. Finish the spell! Emily screamed. I fumbled through the book, my hands shaking uncontrollably as I searched for the final words of the incantation. The voices were still there, whispering in my ear, telling me to stop, to give in, to let it take me. But I forced myself to focus, to drown them out, and I began to read the strange, twisted words aloud. The darkness screeched, a sound so piercing and vile that it made my entire body convulse. I could feel it fighting against the spell, pushing back with everything it had. The air crackled with energy, the very walls of the house trembling as the power of the spell collided with the malevolent force inside the room. But I kept going, my voice rising over the noise, louder and stronger with each word. The darkness recoiled, shrinking away from the circle, its shape unraveling like smoke in the wind. The whispers turned to screams, the voices desperate, pleading now. No. The figure flickered, its form becoming less solid, less real. I could feel the power of the spell taking hold, pulling the darkness back into whatever hell it had come from. With one final, ear-splitting shriek, the darkness imploded, collapsing in on itself and disappearing into the void. And then, just like that, it was gone. The room fell silent, the oppressive weight that had filled the air lifting in an instant. The shadows were gone, the air no longer cold, the voices no longer whispering in my head. The doll lay in pieces on the floor, nothing more than a pile of broken porcelain. It was over. Or so I thought. But as I looked down at the shattered remains of the doll, I saw something I hadn't noticed before. Among the broken fragments of porcelain, something was moving. A small, black shape, writhing and twisting like a tiny, living thing. The spirit hadn't been destroyed. It had only just begun. Part 5, The Final Confrontation. I stood frozen, staring at the writhing black mass among the shattered porcelain. It was smaller now, far smaller than the towering shadow it had been before, but it was still alive. Still moving. The whispers had faded, but a new sound filled the room, a low, rhythmic pulsing, like a heartbeat, slow and heavy. Emily struggled to her feet beside me, her breath coming in ragged gasps. Her face was pale, streaked with sweat, and there was a raw, haunted look in her eyes that sent a chill down my spine. That shouldn't be possible," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "The spell should have worked. It should have sent it back." But the thing wasn't gone. The malevolent energy it radiated was weaker now, but it was still there, lurking, waiting. I could feel it. The worst part was that the darkness wasn't just lingering in the air, it was gathering strength, feeding on the fear that still hung thick around us. Emily grabbed my arm, her fingers digging into my skin. "We need to end this, now," she said, her voice rising with urgency. "We can't let it grow stronger again. Whatever it is, it's holding on, it's refusing to leave." "But how?" I asked, panic creeping into my voice. "We did everything. The spell, the circle, what else is there?" Emily's gaze shifted to the remains of the doll, her eyes narrowing. "The vessel," she muttered. "It wasn't just the doll, it was something else." My mind raced. The attic. The markings on the doll's back. There had to be more to the story, more to why my grandmother had hidden that thing in her house. My grandmother, she must have known something. She had to. There were markings on the doll's back, but maybe it wasn't just about the doll. Emily's eyes lit up with sudden realization. "Your grandmother," she breathed. "She might have bound the spirit, but not to the doll alone. It could be bound to something else, something deeper." I felt my stomach drop. "Bound to what?" "To the house," she said, her voice filled with dread. "If it's not just tied to the doll, then it could be tied to the house itself. That's why it's not leaving." I stumbled back, my mind reeling. The spirit wasn't just using the doll as a vessel, it was using the house. My house. I could feel its presence now, like a low hum vibrating through the walls, an almost imperceptible tension in the air, as if the entire building had become part of the thing's twisted body. "We need to leave," I said, my voice shaking. "We have to get out of here." Emily shook her head, her eyes wide with fear. "If it's bound to the house, leaving won't stop it. It will follow you. It will grow stronger, and it will find a new way to get inside you. The only way to end this is to destroy it here, where it's bound." I stared at her, my heart hammering in my chest. "How?" She looked down at the small, writhing mass of darkness on the floor, her face set in grim determination. "We need to sever the connection. Destroy whatever it's bound to. We have to find the source, the thing that's holding the spirit here. There must be something in this house. Something your grandmother used to bind it." Her words sent a surge of terror through me. The house was filled with my grandmother's belongings, relics of her past, things I had barely touched since her death. Any one of them could be the key to this nightmare. But where would we even start? Emily grabbed my arm again, pulling me toward the stairs. "We need to check the attic," she said, her voice tight. "That's where you found the doll. If your grandmother bound the spirit, there might be something else up there." We raced up the stairs, the air growing colder as we ascended. The darkness seemed to follow us, a creeping presence that lingered just at the edges of my vision. By the time we reached the attic door, my hands were shaking so badly I could barely turn the knob. The attic was just as I had left it, dusty and filled with old boxes, covered furniture, and forgotten relics of the past. But now, it felt different, oppressive, heavy, as if the air itself was weighed down by the malevolent energy that pulsed through the house. The pulsing, rhythmic sound was louder here, more insistent, like the heartbeat of something ancient and terrible. Emily moved quickly, rummaging through the boxes, her hands moving with a frantic desperation. "There has to be something," she muttered. "Something that's holding it here." I joined her, tearing open boxes, throwing aside old papers and mementos, my breath coming in short, panicked gasps. I didn't know what I was looking for, but I knew that we were running out of time. The darkness was growing stronger, creeping closer, and the air was thick with the stench of decay. Then I saw it. In the corner of the attic, half buried under a pile of old blankets, was a small wooden chest. It looked out of place, older than anything else in the attic, its surface etched with strange symbols, similar to the ones I had seen on the doll's back. My heart pounded as I reached for it, my fingers trembling. "Emily," I called out, my voice shaking. "I think I found something." She rushed over, her eyes widening when she saw the chest. "That's it," she breathed. "It has to be." We both knelt in front of the chest, and I hesitated for a moment before opening it. Inside was a small, ornate jar, sealed with wax. The same symbols were etched into the jar's surface, glowing faintly in the dim light of the attic. I didn't need to ask what it was, I knew. This was the vessel. This was what my grandmother had used to bind the spirit. Emily's hands shook as she pulled a small knife from her bag, her face pale and grim. "We need to break the seal," she said. "But once we do, there's no going back. The spirit will be free, and we'll only have moments to destroy it." I nodded, my throat tight with fear. "Let's do it." With a deep breath, Emily brought the knife down, slicing through the wax seal. The moment the seal broke, the air in the attic seemed to explode, a violent gust of wind knocking us both backward. The jar shook, the symbols glowing brighter, and a terrible screech filled the room, a sound so horrible, so filled with rage, that I felt my entire body seize up in terror. The darkness surged out of the jar, forming into a twisting, writhing mass that filled the attic. It was no longer small, it was monstrous, a swirling vortex of shadow and hate that clawed at the walls, tearing through the very fabric of the house. The whispers returned, louder, more frenzied than before, each word dripping with venom. "You, let me out." I could barely think, barely breathe. The darkness was all around us, a living nightmare that threatened to consume everything in its path. But Emily didn't falter. She grabbed the jar and hurled it to the floor with all her strength. The jar shattered. The moment it broke, the darkness let out a terrible scream, a sound so loud and so filled with fury that I thought my ears would burst. The shadow twisted and writhed, shrinking in on itself, as if it was being pulled apart by an invisible force. The air crackled with energy, the attic shaking violently as the spirit was ripped from the house, its hold finally broken. And then, with one final, ear-piercing shriek, it was gone. The attic fell silent. I collapsed to the floor, gasping for breath, my entire body trembling. Emily knelt beside me, her face pale and streaked with tears, but she was smiling, a small, weary smile of victory. "It's over," she whispered. "It's finally over." But as we sat there, catching our breath, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was still wrong. The house was quiet, too quiet. And then I heard it. A faint, soft sound, coming from behind me. A whisper. "You let me out." I turned, and there, in the corner of the attic, the broken pieces of the jar began to move. The darkness wasn't gone. It was still here. And it was hungry. The end.